To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf. The Window, Chapter 4. Indeed, he almost knocked her easel over, coming down upon her with his hands waving, shouting out, "Boldly we rode and well." But mercifully he turned sharp and rode off, to die gloriously, she supposed, upon the heights of Balaclava. Never was anybody at once so ridiculous and so alarming. But so long as he kept like that, waving, shouting, she was safe. He would not stand still and look at her picture. And that was what Lily Briscoe could not have endured. Even while she looked at the mass, at the line, at the color, at Mrs. Ramsay, sitting in the window with James, she kept a feeler on her surroundings, lest someone should creep up, and suddenly she would find her picture looked at. But now, with all her senses quickened, as they were looking, straining, till the color of the wall and the Jacmana beyond burnt into her eyes, she was aware of someone coming out of the house, coming towards her, but somehow divined from the footfall William Banks, so that her brush quivered. She did not, as she would have done had it been Mr. Tansley, Paul Rayleigh, Minta Doyle, or practically anybody else, turn her canvas upon the grass, but let it stand. William Banks stood beside her. They had rooms in the village, and so, walking in, walking out, parting late on doormats, had said little things about the soup, about the children, about one thing and another which made them allies, so that when he stood beside her now, in his judicial way, he was old enough to be her father too, a botanist, a widower, smelling of soap, very scrupulous and clean. She just stood there. He just stood there. Her shoes were excellent, he observed. They allowed the toes their natural expansion. Lodging in the same house with her, he had noticed, too, how orderly she was. Up before breakfast and off to paint, he believed, alone. Poor, presumably, and without the complexion or the allurement of Miss Doyle, certainly, but with a good sense, which made her, in his eyes, superior to that young lady. Now, for instance, when Ramsay bore down on them, shouting, gesticulating, Miss Briscoe, he felt certain, understood. Someone had blundered. Mr. Ramsay glared at them. He glared at them without seeming to see them. That did make them both vaguely uncomfortable. Together they had seen a thing they had not been meant to see. They had encroached upon a privacy. So, Lily thought, it was probably an excuse of his for moving, for getting out of earshot, that made Mr. Banks almost immediately say something about its being chilly and suggested taking a stroll. She would come, yes, but it was with difficulty that she took her eyes off her picture. The Jacmana was bright violet, the walls staring white. She would not have considered it honest to tamper with the bright violet and the staring white, since she saw them like that, fashionable though it was, since Mr. Pangsfort's visit, to see everything pale, elegant, semi-transparent. Then, beneath the color there was the shape. She could see it all so clearly, so commandingly, when she looked. It was when she took her brush in hand that the whole thing changed. It was in that moment's flight between the picture and her canvas that the demon set on her who often brought her to the verge of tears and made this passage from conception to work as dreadful as any down a dark passage for a child. Such she often felt herself, struggling against terrific odds to maintain her courage, to say, "But this is what I see. This is what I see." And so, to clasp some miserable remnant of her vision to her breast, which 1,000 forces did their best to pluck from her. And it was then, too, in that chill and windy way, as she began to paint, that there forced themselves upon her other things, her own inadequacy, her insignificance, keeping house for her father off the Brompton Road, and had much ado to control her impulse to fling herself, thank heaven she had always resisted so far, at Mrs. Ramsay's knee, and say to her, but what could one say to her? "I'm in love with you?" No, that was not true. "I'm in love with this all," waving her hand at the hedge, at the house, at the children. It was absurd. It was impossible. So now she laid her brushes neatly in the box, side by side, and said to William Banks, "It suddenly gets cold. The sun seems to give less heat," she said, looking about her, for it was bright enough. The grass was still a soft, deep green, the house starred in its greenery with purple passion flowers, and rooks dropping cool cries from the high blue. But something moved, flashed, turned a silver wing in the air. It was September after all, the middle of September, and past 6 in the evening. So off they strolled, down the garden in the usual direction, past the tennis lawn, past the pampas grass, to that break in the thick hedge, guarded by red-hot pokers like braziers of clear burning coal, between which the blue waters of the bay looked bluer than ever. They came there regularly every evening, drawn by some need. It was as if the water floated off and set sailing thoughts which had grown stagnant on dry land, and gave to their bodies even some sort of physical relief. First, the pulse of color flooded the bay with blue, and the heart expanded with it, and the body swam, only the next instant to be checked and chilled by the prickly blackness on the ruffled waves. Then, up behind the great black rock, almost every evening spurted irregularly, so that one had to watch for it, and it was a delight when it came. A fountain of white water. And then, while one waited for that, one watched, on the pale semicircular beach, wave after wave, shedding again and again, smoothly, a film of mother of pearl. They both smiled, standing there. They both felt a common hilarity, excited by the moving waves, and then by the swift cutting race of a sailing boat, which, having sliced a curve in the bay, stopped, shivered, let its sails drop down, and then with a natural instinct to complete the picture, after this swift movement, both of them looked at the dunes far away, and instead of merriment, felt come over them some sadness, because the thing was completed partly, and partly because distant views seemed to outlast by 1,000,000 years, Lily thought, the gazer, and to be communing already with the sky which beholds an earth entirely at rest. Looking at the far sand hills, William Banks thought of Ramsay, thought of a road in Westmoreland, thought of Ramsay striding along a road by himself, hung round with that solitude that seemed to be his natural air. But this was suddenly interrupted. William Banks remembered, and this must refer to some actual incident, by a hen, straddling her wings out in protection of a covey of little chicks, upon which Ramsay, stopping, pointed his stick and said, "Pretty, pretty." An odd illumination into his heart. Banks had thought it, which showed his simplicity, his sympathy with humble things. But it seemed to him as if their friendship had ceased there, on that stretch of road. After that, Ramsay had married. After that, what with one thing and another, the pulp had gone out of their friendship. Whose fault it was he could not say, only after a time repetition had taken the place of newness. It was to repeat that they met, but in this dumb colloquy with the sand dunes, he maintained that his affection for Ramsay had in no way diminished, but there, like the body of a young man laid up in peat for a century, with the red fresh on his lips, was his friendship, in its acuteness and reality, laid up across the bay among the sandhills. He was anxious for the sake of this friendship, and perhaps, too, in order to clear himself in his own mind from the imputation of having dried and shrunk. For Ramsay lived in a welter of children, whereas Banks was childless and a widower. He was anxious that Lily Briscoe should not disparage Ramsay, a great man in his own way, yet should understand how things stood between them. Begun long years ago, their friendship had petered out on a Westmoreland road, where the hen spread her wings before her chicks, after which Ramsay had married, and their paths lying different ways, there had been, certainly for no one's fault, some tendency, when they met, to repeat. Yes, that was it. He finished. He turned from the view, and, turning to walk back the other way, up the drive, Mr. Banks was alive to things which would not have struck him had not those sandhills revealed to him the body of his friendship lying with the red on its lips, laid up in peat. For instance, Cam, the little girl, Ramsay's youngest daughter, she was picking sweet Alice on the bank. She was wild and fierce. She would not give a flower to the gentleman, as the nursemaid told her. No, 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 she would not. She clenched her fist, she stamped, and Mr. Banks felt aged and saddened, and somehow put into the wrong by her about his friendship. He must have dried and shrunk. The Ramsays were not rich, and it was a wonder how they managed to contrive it all. 8 children. To feed 8 children on philosophy. Here was another of them, Jasper this time, strolling past. To have a shot at a bird, he said nonchalantly, swinging Lily's hand like a pump handle as he passed, which caused Mr. Banks to say bitterly how she was a favorite. There was education now to be considered. True, Mrs. Ramsay had something of her own, perhaps, let alone the daily wear and tear of shoes and stockings which those great fellows, all well-grown, angular, ruthless youngsters, must require. As for being which was which, or in what order they came, that was beyond him. He called them privately after the kings and queens of England, Cam the wicked, James the ruthless, Andrew the just, Prue the fair, for Prue would have beauty, he thought. How could she help it? And Andrew brains. Well, he walked up the driveway, and Lily Briscoe said yes and no and capped his comments, for she was in love with them all, in love with this world. He weighed Ramsay's case, commiserated him, envied him, as if he had seen him divest himself of all those glories of isolation and austerity which crowned him in youth, to cumber himself definitely with fluttering wings and clucking domesticities. They gave him something, William Banks acknowledged that. It would have been pleasant if Cam had stuck a flower in his coat or clambered over his shoulder, as over her father's, to look at a picture of Vesuvius in eruption. But they had also, his old friends could not but feel, destroyed something. What would a stranger think now? What did this Lily Briscoe think? Could one help noticing that habits grew on him? Eccentricities, weaknesses perhaps. It was astonishing that a man of his intellect could stoop so low as he did. But that was too harsh a phrase. Could depend so much as he did upon people's praise. Oh, but, said Lily, think of his work. Whenever she thought of his work, she always saw clearly before her a large kitchen table. It was Andrew's doing. She asked him what his father's books were about. Subject and object, the nature of reality, Andrew had said. And when she said heavens, she had no notion what that meant. Think of a kitchen table, then, he told her, when you're not there. So, now she always saw, when she thought of Mr. Ramsay's work, a scrubbed kitchen table. It lodged now in the fork of a pear tree, for they had reached the orchard. and with a painful effort of concentration, she focused her mind not upon the silver-bossed bark of the tree or upon its fish-shaped leaves, but upon a phantom kitchen table, one of those scrubbed board tables, grained and knotted, whose virtue seems to have been laid bare by years of muscular integrity, which, stuck there, its 4 legs in air. Naturally, if one's days were passed in this seeing of angular essences, this reducing of lovely evenings with all their flamingo clouds and blue and silver to a white deal 4-legged table, and it was a mark of the finest minds to do so. Naturally, one could not be judged like an ordinary person. Mr. Banks liked her for bidding him think of his work. He had thought of it, often and often. Times without number he had said, "Ramsay is one of those men who do their best work before they are 40. He had made a definite contribution to philosophy in one little book when he was only 25. What came after was more or less amplification, repetition. But the number of men who make a definite contribution to anything whatsoever is very small," he said, pausing by the pear tree, well brushed, scrupulously exact, exquisitely judicial. Suddenly, as if the movement of his hand had released it, the load of her accumulated impressions of him tilted up, and down poured in a ponderous avalanche all she felt about him. That was one sensation. Then uprose in a fume the essence of his being. That was another. She felt herself transfixed by the intensity of her perception. It was his severity, his goodness. "I respect you," she addressed silently, him in person. "In every atom. You are not vain. You are not entirely impersonal. You are finer than Mr. Ramsay. You are the finest human being that I know. You have neither wife nor child." Without any sexual feeling, she longed to cherish that loneliness. "You live for science." Involuntarily, sections of potatoes rose before her eyes. "Praise would be an insult to you. Generous, pure-hearted, heroic man." But, simultaneously, she remembered how he had brought a valet all the way up here, objected to dogs on chairs, would prose for hours, until Mr. Ramsay slammed out of the room, about salt in vegetables and the iniquity of English cooks. How then did it work out, all this? How did one judge people, think of them? How did one add up this and that and conclude that it was liking one felt or disliking? And to those words, what meaning attached, after all? Standing now, apparently transfixed, by the pear tree, impressions poured in upon her of those 2 men, and to follow her thought was like following a voice which speaks too quickly to be taken down by one's pencil. And the voice was her own voice, saying without prompting undeniable, everlasting, contradictory things, so that even the fissures and humps on the bark of the pear tree were irrevocably fixed there for eternity. "You have greatness," she continued, "but Mr. Ramsay has none of it. He is petty, selfish, vain, egotistical. He is spoiled. He is a tyrant. He wears Mrs. Ramsay to death. But he has what you," she addressed Mr. Banks, "have not. A fiery unworldliness. He knows nothing about trifles. He loves dogs and his children. He has 8. Mr. Banks has none. Did he not come down in 2 coats the other night and let Mrs. Ramsay trim his hair into a pudding basin? All of this danced up and down like a company of gnats, each separate but all marvelously controlled, in an invisible elastic net, danced up and down in Lily's mind, in and about the branches of the pear tree, where still hung in effigy the scrubbed kitchen table, symbol of her profound respect for Mr. Ramsay's mind, until her thought, which had spun quicker and quicker, exploded of its own intensity. She felt released. A shot went off close at hand, and there came, flying from its fragments, frightened, effusive, tumultuous, a flock of starlings. "Jasper!" said Mr. Banks. They turned the way the starlings flew, over the terrace. Following the scatter of swift-flying birds in the sky, they stepped through the gap in the high hedge, straight into Mr. Ramsay, who boomed tragically at them. "Someone had blundered." His eyes, glazed with emotion, defiant with tragic intensity, met theirs for a second and trembled on the verge of recognition, but then, raising his hand halfway to his face as if to avert, to brush off in an agony of peevish shame their normal gaze, as if he begged them to withhold for a moment what he knew to be inevitable, as if he impressed upon them his own childlike resentment of interruption, yet, even in the moment of discovery, was not to be routed utterly, but was determined to hold fast to something of this delicious emotion, this impure rhapsody, of which he was ashamed, but in which he revelled. He turned abruptly, slammed his private door on them, and Lily Briscoe and Mr. Banks looked uneasily up into the sky, observed that the flock of starlings which Jasper had routed with his gun had settled on the tops of the elm trees. Chapter 5. "And even if it isn't fine tomorrow," said Mrs. Ramsay, raising her eyes to glance at William Banks and Lily Briscoe as they passed, "it will be another day. And now," she said, thinking that Lily's charm was her Chinese eyes, aslant in her white puckered little face, but it would take a clever man to see it. "And now, stand up and let me measure your leg. For they might go to the lighthouse after all, and she must see if the stocking did not need to be an inch or two longer in the leg." Smiling, for it was an admirable idea that had flashed upon her this very second, William and Lily should marry. She took the heather mixture stocking with its criss-cross of steel needles at the mouth of it and measured it against James's leg. "My dear, stand still," she said, for in his jealousy, not liking to serve as a measuring block for the lighthouse keeper's little boy, James fidgeted purposely. And if he did that, how could she see, was it too long, was it too short? She asked. She looked up. What demon possessed him? Her youngest, her cherished. And saw the room, saw the chairs, thought them fearfully shabby. Their entrails, as Andrew said the other day, were all over the floor. But then what was the point, she asked, of buying good chairs to let them spoil up here through the winter, when the house, with only one old woman to see to it, positively dripped with wet? Never mind the rent was precisely 2 pence halfpenny. The children loved it. It did her husband good to be 3,000, or if she must be accurate, 300 miles from his libraries and his lectures and his disciples, and there was room for visitors, mats, camp beds, crazy ghosts of chairs and tables whose London life of service was done. They did well enough here, and a photograph or two, and books, she thought, grew of themselves. She never had time to read them, alas, even the books that had been given her and inscribed by the hand of the poet himself, for her whose wishes must be obeyed. The happier Helen of our days. Disgraceful to say she had never read them. And Croom on the mind and Bates on the savage customs of Polynesia. My dear, stand still, she said. Neither of those could one send to the lighthouse. At a certain moment, she supposed, the house would become so shabby that something must be done. If they could be taught to wipe their feet and not bring the beach in with them, that would be something. Crabs she had to allow, if Andrew really wished to dissect them. Or, if Jasper believed that one could make soup from seaweed, one could not prevent it. or Rose's objects, shells, reeds, stones, for they were gifted her children, but all in quite different ways. And the result of it was, she sighed, taking in the whole room, floor to ceiling, as she held the stocking against James's leg, that things got shabbier and got shabbier, summer after summer. The mat was fading. The wallpaper was flapping. You couldn't tell any more that those were roses on it. Still, if every door in a house is left perpetually open, and no lockmaker in the whole of Scotland can mend a bolt, things must spoil. What was the use of flinging a green cashmere shawl over the edge of a picture frame? In 2 weeks it would be the color of pea soup. But it was the doors that annoyed her. Every door was left open. She listened. The drawing-room door was open. The hall door was open. It sounded as if the bedroom doors were open, and certainly the window on the landing was open, for that she had opened herself. That windows should be open and doors shut, simple as it was, could none of them remember it? She would go into the maid's bedroom at night and find them sealed like ovens, except for Marie's, the Swiss girl, who would rather go without a bath than without fresh air. But then at home, she said, "The mountains are so beautiful." She had said that last night, looking out of the window with tears in her eyes. "The mountains are so beautiful." Her father was dying there. Mrs. Ramsay knew. He was leaving them fatherless, scolding and demonstrating how to make a bed, how to open a window with hands that shut and spread like a Frenchwoman's. All had folded itself quietly about her. When the girl spoke, as after a flight through the sunshine, the wings of a bird fold themselves quietly, and the blue of its plumage changes from bright steel to soft purple. She had stood there silent, for there was nothing to be said. He had cancer of the throat. At the recollection, how she had stood there, how the girl had said, "At home the mountains are so beautiful," and there was no hope whatsoever, she had a spasm of irritation. Anne, speaking sharply, said to James, "Stand still. Don't be tiresome," so that he knew instantly that her severity was real, and straightened his leg, and she measured it. The stocking was too short by half an inch at least, making allowance for the fact that Sorley's little boy would be less well grown than James. "It's too short," she said, "ever so much too short." Never did anybody look so sad, bitter and black halfway down in the darkness in the shaft, which ran from the sunlight to the depths. Perhaps a tear formed. A tear fell. The water swayed this way and that, received it, and were at rest. Never did anybody look so sad. But was it nothing but looks, people said? What was there behind it, her beauty and splendor? Had he blown his brains out, they asked? Had he died the week before they were married? Some other earlier lover of whom rumors reached one? Or was there nothing but an incomparable beauty, which she lived behind, and could do nothing to disturb? For easily though she might have said at some moment of intimacy, when stories of great passion, of love foiled, of ambition thwarted came her way, how she too had known, or felt, or been through it herself, she never spoke. She was silent, always. She knew then, she knew without having learnt. Her simplicity fathomed what clever people falsified. Her singleness of mind made her drop plumb like a stone, a light exact as a bird, gave her naturally this swoop and fall of the spirit upon truth which delighted, eased, sustained, falsely perhaps. "Nature has but little clay," said Mr. Banks once, much moved by her voice on the telephone, though she was only telling him a fact about a train, "like that of which she moulded you." He saw her, at the end of the line, Greek, blue-eyed, straight-nosed. How incongruous it seemed to be telephoning to a woman like that. The Graces assembling seemed to have joined hands in meadows of asphodel to compose that face. Yes, he would catch the 10:30 at Euston. But she's no more aware of her beauty than a child, said Mr. Banks, replacing the receiver and crossing the room to see what progress the workmen were making with an hotel which they were building at the back of his house. And he thought of Mrs. Ramsay as he looked at that stir among the unfinished walls, for always, he thought, there was something incongruous to be worked into the harmony of her face. She clapped a deerstalker's hat on her head. She ran across the lawn in galoshes to snatch a child from mischief, so that if it was her beauty merely that one thought of, one must remember the quivering thing, the living thing. They were carrying bricks up a little plank as he watched them, and work it into the picture. Or, if one thought of her simply as a woman, one must endow her with some freak of idiosyncrasy. She did not like admiration, or suppose some latent desire to doff her royalty of form, as if her beauty bored her, and all that men say of beauty, and she wanted only to be like other people, insignificant. He did not know. He did not know. He must go to his work. Knitting her reddish-brown hairy stocking, with her head outlined absurdly by the gilt frame, the green shawl which she had tossed over the edge of the frame, and the authenticated masterpiece by Michelangelo, Mrs. Ramsay smoothed out what had been harsh in her manner a moment before, raised his head, and kissed her little boy on the forehead. "Let us find another picture to cut out," she said. Chapter 6. But what had happened? Someone had blundered. Starting from her musing, she gave meaning to words which she had held meaningless in her mind for a long stretch of time. Someone had blundered. Fixing her short-sighted eyes upon her husband, who was now bearing down upon her, she gazed steadily with his closeness revealed to her. The jingle made it itself in her head. That something had happened. Someone had blundered. But she could not for the life of her think what. He shivered. He quivered. All his vanity, all his satisfaction in his own splendor riding fell as a thunderbolt, fierce as a hawk at the head of his men through the valley of death, had been shattered, destroyed. Stormed at by shot and shell, boldly we rode and well, flashed through the valley of death, volleyed and thundered, straight into Lily Briscoe and William Banks. He quivered. He shivered. Not for the world would she have spoken to him, realizing from the familiar signs his eyes averted and some curious gathering together of his person, as if he wrapped himself about and needed privacy into which to regain his equilibrium, that he was outraged and anguished. She stroked James's head. She transferred to him what she felt for her husband, and as she watched him, chalk yellow, the white dress shirt of a gentleman in the Navy and Army Stores catalogue, thought what a delight it would be to her should he turn out a great artist. And why should he not? He had a splendid forehead. Then, looking up as her husband passed her once more, she was relieved to find that the ruin was veiled. Domesticity triumphed. Custom crooned its soothing rhythm. So that when stopping deliberately, as his turn came round again at the window, he bent quizzically and whimsically to tickle James's bare calf with a sprig of something. She twitted him for having dispatched that poor young man, Charles Tansley. Tansley had had to go in and write his dissertation, he said. James will have to write his dissertation one of these days, he added ironically, flicking his sprig. Heeding his father, James brushed away the tickling spray, with which, in a manner peculiar to him, compound of severity and humor, he teased his youngest son's bare leg. She was trying to get these tiresome stockings finished to send to Sorley's little boy tomorrow, said Mrs. Ramsay. There wasn't the slightest possible chance that they could go to the Lighthouse tomorrow, Mr. Ramsay snapped out irascibly. How did he know? She asked. The winds often changed. The extraordinary irrationality of her remark, the folly of women's minds, enraged him. He had ridden through the valley of death, been shattered and shivered, and now she flew in the face of facts, made his children hope what was utterly out of the question. In effect, told lies. He stamped his foot on the stone step. "Damn you," he said. But what had she said? Simply that it might be fine tomorrow. So it might. Not with the barometer falling and the wind due west. To pursue truth with such astonishing lack of consideration for other people's feelings, to rend the thin veils of civilization so wantonly, so brutally, was to her so horrible an outrage of human decency that without replying, dazed and blinded, she bent her head as if to let the pelt of jagged hail, the drench of dirty water, bespatter her, unrebuked. There was nothing to be said. He stood by her in silence. Very humbly at length, he said that he would step over and ask the coastguards if she liked. There was nobody whom she reverenced as she reverenced him. She was quite ready to take his word for it, she said. Only then they need not cut sandwiches, that was all. They came to her naturally, since she was a woman, all day long with this and that, one wanting this, another that. The children were growing up. She often felt she was nothing but a sponge, sucked full of human emotions. Then he said, "Damn you." He said it must rain. He said it won't rain, and instantly a heaven of security opened before her. There was nobody she reverenced more. She was not good enough to tie a shoestring, she felt. Already ashamed of that petulance, of that gesticulation of the hands when charging at the head of his troops, Mr. Ramsay rather sheepishly prodded his son's bare legs once more. Then, as if he had her leave for it, with a movement which oddly reminded his wife of the great sea lion at the zoo tumbling backwards after swallowing his fish and walloping off so that the water in the tank washes from side to side, he dived into the evening air, which, already thinner, was taking the substance from leaves and hedges, but, as if in return, restoring to roses and pinks a luster which they had not had by day. "Someone has blundered," he said again, striding off and up and down the terrace. But how extraordinarily his note had changed! It was like the cuckoo. In June, he gets out of tune, as if he were trying over, tentatively seeking some phrase for a new mood, and having only this at hand, used it, cracked though it was. But it sounded ridiculous. Someone had blundered, said like that, almost as a question, without any conviction, melodiously. Mrs. Ramsay could not help smiling, and soon, sure enough, walking up and down, he hummed it, dropped it, fell silent. He was safe. He was restored to his privacy. He stopped to light his pipe, looked once at his wife and son in the window, and as one raises one's eyes from a page in an express train and sees a farm, a tree, a cluster of cottages as an illustration, a confirmation of something on the printed page to which one returns fortified and satisfied, so without his distinguishing either his wife or his son, the sight of them fortified him and satisfied him, and consecrated his effort to arrive at a perfectly clear understanding of the problem which now engaged the energies of his splendid mind. It was a splendid mind, for if thought is like the keyboard of a piano, divided into so many notes, or like the alphabet, is ranged in 26 letters all in order, then his splendid mind had no difficulty in running over those letters one by one, firmly and accurately, until it had reached, say, the letter Q. He reached Q. Very few people in the whole of England ever reached Q. Here, stopping for one moment by the stone urn which held the geraniums, he saw, but now far, far away, like children picking up shells, divinely innocent and occupied with little trifles at their feet, and somehow entirely defenseless against a doom which he perceived, his wife and sun together in the window. They needed his protection. He gave it them. But after Q, what comes next? After Q, there are a number of letters, the last of which is scarcely visible to mortal eyes, but glimmers red in the distance. Z is only reached once, by one man in a generation. Still, if he could reach R, it would be something. Here at least was Q. He dug his heels in at Q. Q he was sure of. Q he could demonstrate. If Q then is Q, R. Here he knocked his pipe out, with 2 or 3 resonant taps on the handle of the urn, and proceeded. Then R. He braced himself. He clenched himself. Qualities that would have saved a ship's company exposed on a broiling sea with 6 biscuits and a flask of water, endurance and justice, foresight, devotion, skill, came to his help. R is then... What is R? A shudder, like the leathern eyelid of a lizard, flickered over the intensity of his gaze and obscured the letter R. In that flash of darkness, he heard people saying he was a failure, that R was beyond him. He would never reach R. On to R once more. R. Qualities that, in a desolate expedition across the icy solitudes of the polar region, would have made him the leader, the guide, the counselor, whose temper, neither sanguine nor despondent, surveys with equanimity what is to be and faces it, comes to his help again. R. The lizard's eye flickered once more. The veins on his forehead bulged. The geranium in the urn became startlingly visible, and displayed among its leaves he could see, without wishing it, that obvious distinction between the 2 classes of men. On the one hand, the steady goers of superhuman strength who, plodding and persevering, repeat the whole alphabet in order, 26 letters in all, from start to finish. On the other, the gifted, the inspired, who miraculously lump all the letters together in one flash, the way of genius. He had not genius, he laid no claim to that, but he had, or might have had, the power to repeat every letter of the alphabet from A to Z accurately, in order. Meanwhile, he stuck at Q, on then, on to R. Feelings that would not have disgraced a leader who, now that the snow has begun to fall, and the mountain-top is covered in mist, knows that he must lay himself down and die before morning comes, stole upon him, paling the color of his eyes, giving him, even in the 2 minutes of his turn on the terrace, the bleached look of withered old age. Yet he would not die lying down. He would find some crag of rock, and there, his eyes fixed on the storm, trying to the end to pierce the darkness, he would die standing. He would never reach R. He stood stock still by the urn, with the geranium flowing over it. How many men, in 1,000 million, he asked himself, reach Z after all? Surely the leader of a forlorn hope may ask himself that, and answer without treachery to the expedition behind him. 1, perhaps. 1 in a generation. Is he to be blamed, then, if he is not that one, provided he has toiled honestly, given the best of his power, until he has no more left to give? And his fame lasts how long? Is it permissible even for a dying hero to think before he dies how men will speak of him hereafter? His fame lasts perhaps 2,000 years. And what are 2,000 years? Asked Mr. Ramsay, ironically, staring at the hedge. What, indeed, if you look from a mountain-top down the long wastes of the ages? The very stone one kicks with one's boot will outlast Shakespeare. His own little light would shine not very brightly for a year or two, and would then be merged into some bigger light, and that in a bigger still. He looked into the hedge, into the intricacy of the twigs. Who then could blame the leader of that forlorn party, which after all has climbed high enough to see the waste of the years and the perishing of the stars, if before death stiffens his limbs beyond the power of movement, he does, a little consciously, raise his numbed fingers to his brow and square his shoulders, so that when the search party comes, they will find him dead at his post, the fine figure of a soldier. Mr. Ramsay squared his shoulders and stood very upright by the urn. Who shall blame him, if so standing, for a moment he dwells upon fame, upon search parties, upon cairns raised by grateful followers over his bones? Finally, who shall blame the leader of the doomed expedition, if having adventured to the uttermost, and used his strength wholly to the last ounce and fallen asleep, not much caring if he wakes or not, he now perceives by some pricking in his toes that he lives, and does not on the whole object to live, but requires sympathy and whiskey and someone to tell the story of his suffering to at once? Who shall blame him? Who will not secretly rejoice when the hero puts his armor off and halts by the window and gazes at his wife and son, who, very distant at first, gradually come closer and closer, till lips and book and head are clearly before him, though still lovely and unfamiliar from the intensity of his isolation and the waste of ages and the perishing of the stars, and finally putting his pipe in his pocket and bending his magnificent head before her. Who will blame him if he does homage to the beauty of the world?